Okay.
So it should show that it is recording.
Yes.
And if you all can show us your faces, I would appreciate that. I'm going to start out with any questions that you have. We were talking a little bit about some questions related to the teacher working conditions survey in North Carolina. Do you have any other questions that we need to talk about before we get into tonight's agenda?
I have two, if I may.
Yes.
One of them on the rubric for task 1, it talks about, and I'm kind of the way the rubric is broken down, it makes it seem kind of like the prompt 1 and prompt 2. It talks about the collaboration under the 4.
Okay, now are you talking about the CAP?
Yes, ma'am, CAP task 1. But it talks about in the rubric, the collaboration under the 4. I was trying to pull it up on my computer and it won't pull up, I'm sorry. But I know for prompt 2, we're doing the survey again. So the collaboration and the people involved would be our faculty, our colleagues. Is that the same collaboration factor for prompt 1, or is the collaboration factor for prompt 1, should that be something different? Should that be someone else working with you to dissect the data, or kind of how we've had a group that we've worked with for like Skip and OMA? Or is that, does that make sense, what I'm asking?
Yeah. Well, Barbara, you can answer, but I think
I'll let you go ahead and take the lead on that. And then
okay,
if I'm looking at this, you're talking about 2 different prompts, but it's not labeled that way in the task.
Right, but when you look at the rubric, like it's got the first, it won't pull up, I think, because of the Zoom. It's got the top half where it talks about the only thing different from the 3 to a 4 is the collaboration factor. But then in the second part of the rubric, it talks about the collaboration again. So is that referring to the same factor of redoing the survey with colleagues and getting input? Or should, as you're looking at the 5 areas and looking at the survey, should there be collaboration in that analysis or in that setup different from re-giving out the survey in the second part?
All right, the way I'm looking at this, the key that they're looking for is that you are collaborating with someone to do something. And the key is the collaboration. It is not necessarily, I think they're trying to make sure you don't do it all by yourself and say you're collaborating with someone, but that you actually have somebody that you're talking with and working with at your school. Dr. Tillman, you want to pick up from there?
I think so, and I think a lot of, it was sort of muddy in the town hall, I think. And when you, some people are putting a lot of task 2 in task 1, in that actually the qualitative, all that qualitative work is in task 2. Of course, when you get it smashed together, it won't make a difference because it's going to flow one to the other. But I think that's a more concerning effort. So as long as there is a collaborative team and that you're collaborating with a group, because when you make the recommendations, hopefully those recommendations are coming from a group consensus based on the data you have pulled together. Because anytime you're making the recommendations, we think that's a collaborative process.
Now, the thing that I am seeing missing from most of your all's work when I'm reading it, the thing I'm finding that I don't see much about, and it is clearly in there at the proficient level for the rubric, is your recommendations are to be based on needs to include strategies that improve the school environment for teaching and learning. And this is the part I'm not finding. With attention paid to issues of diversity and equity. You may be, and in some situations you are talking about it, but you're not focusing on it and bringing it out. Now, my focus all along this semester and anytime I'm teaching is you want to make it so easy for your evaluator that there's no way they can miss it. Well, I'm afraid because of the way that we're not really pointing that out, we're just putting it in that last part, that they're going to miss it. And so it might get sent back to you. But that's what I'm finding is missing more than anything else. It's there a little bit, but it's not real clear. It's not brought out. It's not focused on. Is that some of the same things you're finding, Dr. Tillman?
Yeah, and when you make a recommendation, it's not, we're going to improve the climate of the school, or we're going to, clean up the facility. The strategy part of that requires that you do the how. You've got to move forward. And some of you are not, I've had a couple of papers that the teacher working conditions survey or the advanced ed work, the actual data were not presented. You can't just talk through it. You have to include the data. So, that's a big thing that's missing also. And I try to be a real stickler on this one, because this is a case where if you don't do all 5 areas and you don't make a recommendation in all 5 areas, then when you get to 2 and 3, you're not going to know what to do, because you've got to address those 5 areas. And a couple of you have said, we don't have any problems in these things. And what I've said back to you is, then tell how you're going to maintain this stellar achievement that you have now. You've got to have something in the plan to deal with in level 2 and 3, okay?
And don't forget, look clearly at that rubric. It says, identified needs include strategies that improve the school environment for teaching and learning, with attention paid to issues of diversity and equity. There's a lot in what it's saying that you've got to do there. So you really need to pay close attention to what it is and how you say it in your task. Now, all of the stuff with the CAP, you only turn in the task 1 to us now, but you will do all of the rest of it. And if you're, I would recommend you go ahead and get the CAP finished before this, you start summer school, because those 10 weeks are going to go so fast. But have them ready to submit to your summer school teachers' grade book or Blackboard, so that they can look at them and you can get moving. But the only one that has to be turned in for us is task 1. So just try to get ahead, because those 10 weeks are going to go fast, especially at the same time that some of you are ending school. Some of you are getting out earlier, but some of you are ending school. So sometimes this summer school session is at one of the worst times in your life for you to get the work done. But that's why I recommend, and why Dr. Lamb introduced all the things, and why I spent some more time going over them, to give you a chance to get ahead so that you will be able to finish up this summer.
Could I also add that finishing up means you have your competency folio up to date where it should be. I still have about 3 or 4 people that I cannot get into their folios, and some of them are in really strange shape. If you put in your work, if you went in there and you clicked on, say, communication, and you put your first one from fall there, and then you came back this semester and you started dropping them down as a subheading under communication, it's going to look like you only have 2 things done and you need 3. You've got one of them stuck up there where it's supposed to be, but then you went back and tried another format for this semester. And so it's going to be a mess. And when the final evaluator tries to look for it, they're probably going to send it back to you until they figure out you've got it in 2 places. And I've tried to tell you about it. So just try to make sure you get it in there. And there are some of them that I haven't seen anything, and I'm concerned about that. I think
Dr. Todd, Dr. Tillman.
no, you got yours cleared up. I think yours got cleared up, Mr. Longhorn.
When you talk about the drop down, and
well, we're not going to talk about. I don't want to take her class time. I'm just saying that when she says you need to have the skip and you need to have the OMA done, that means you need to have the competency folio pieces done also. Because if you don't do those and you end up going to summer school and you've got to go back and you've got to do the skip, the OMA, the CAP, the SHIAP, and the ending details, you're not going to make it. And I just beg you to do the work now.
Can I ask a question on something different?
Yes.
I'm one of the few that are trying to finish up my skip 4. And I know there's a crossover between the CAP and the skip on that, and I'm not fully understanding what that is. We're supposed to add something in there with our what we've done with the CAP as well before we turn this in.
Okay, that's only task 4.
Yes.
And at this point in time, my suggestion is to not worry about it and just address what you've done with the skip.
Perfect.
And this is the reason why. At one point in time, the CAP was done before the skip. And then you reflected on both the CAP and the skip at the same time in the 4 because of the fact that you didn't have to do it in the CAP. So because they changed the order when they were trying to do the add-on and trying to get things that we could get done in a semester, don't worry about that. But do make sure that you comment on the coursework, the readings, as well as your internship activities. And you can also make it a little bit generic and say, in my tasks, in my artifact development, and then you don't have to really say which one it is, but you can talk about your artifact development. So I think, you know, and if you are far enough along and you can look at the CAP and you know what you're having to do in that first one, you can comment on it in one of those competencies that you're talking about. Now, for the competency folio, there are specific things that you're supposed to put in.
Right. And you really shouldn't do CAP submissions until you've done the CAP and know what to reflect on. I was sort of amazed that I have people that are putting in CAP and basically they're just pictures of people doing something, you know, because you really haven't done a whole lot of anything. So.
Okay. Is that
Can I ask a question? It's back to the CAP 1. I'm still unclear about the portion that talks about improving the school environment for teaching and learning with attention paid to issues of diversity and equity. So I'm probably one of the people that I'm sure that I am. Then I need to clarify that, but I'm not really sure how. I need more clarification on that portion.
All right, what is in your school can you do that is going to make it a place where children of any race, creed, or color is going to feel good about being there? How can you embrace all kinds of different people, whether they look like you, act like you, or think like you? You know, when you look at that, it's talking about an environment that accepts people and encourages people to do the best that they can in their learning, and also teachers in their teaching. I dare say that many of you don't like everybody you teach with. And I dare say you don't like every child in your building. But your responsibility is to help your coworkers do as good a job as they can, whether you like them or not, whether they're like you or they're different. You know, I used to, when I was a principal, I looked at it this way. I didn't want everybody who was like me because that would be a very dull and boring place. I really enjoyed seeing people who were as different from me as possible, because I could look at their creativity and I thought, man, look what they're adding to this school. Look how much the things that they're doing is encouraging our children to come to school. You know, the people you don't want to forget is your art and music teachers and your PE teachers. Many times they are the ones that get your kids there. You know, that's the one thing in the day that they look forward to. Your cafeteria ladies and your bus drivers, sometimes they're the first two people that speak to your kids and say, have a great day. And they may be the most important people to those children in that day. So you're not just looking at it from the specific things about you know what it is you do in the classrooms. You're looking at the whole environment. How is it that you can get your school to work with all the people, whether they like them or not, or whether they're like you or not, and that you also can encourage people of different beliefs and people who are different from you, who look different from you, who act different from you, but yet you're helping them all to learn, you're helping them all to grow. Does that help? Dr. Tillman, you want to add some to that?
I think you said it really well. Just think about what climate means to you. Just it's hard to put your finger on, but you can feel it when you walk in the building almost. And so what does teacher empowerment do to that? How does that feeling of acceptance happen with teacher empowerment? Okay, are the people selected always the minority and the majority of the children don't see their kind of people in leadership? I mean, how is that? The facilities. Is it a high poverty school and nobody cares about the custodial staff, and so they limit the custodial staff and they, you know, they don't care what happens and the building just gets dirtier and dirtier and nobody cares? Or do you try to make the school a haven for kids? I love what you said about the cafeteria workers, because I worked in a high poverty school, and one of the best people in our school was the cafeteria manager, who got in there early in the morning. This tells you how old I am. And she made those huge pans full of homemade biscuits, and she brought homemade butter and jam from her house and put out there, and she didn't serve it on anything. She just put out napkins and forks and spoons, and the kids just knew to come in and they could have all the biscuits and butter, and sometimes she had honey and jam. You know, that's what we're talking about. Now, you don't have that, but I'm just saying that's an example, and to me, that made that person so important to that student that didn't have anything to eat.
And sometimes they are the first people that they'll encounter. And if they help them have a good morning, then your whole day goes better. But, you know, I have been in a school, I've been in several schools, and when you walk in, you get a feel for the school. And until you've been in this role, you don't really know what I'm talking about most of the time, because you don't pick it up. But I could walk into one school and I just knew everything there was orderly, because you walk in the office, the ladies are there to speak to you. They know exactly where the principal is. You tell them you need to see the principal, they'll find him in just a heartbeat. And everything is clean. The halls are clean. Everything is shining. Those two custodians in that school were two of my favorite people. And it wasn't the school I worked in, because I was already at the central office, but they were happy. They loved the children. They spoke to the children. Those floors were shiny every day that you walked into that school. And so, you know, they had as much to do with making that environment a nice, neat, orderly place that kids love to come as anybody else. And so, you know, don't just assume that it falls all on the shoulders of the principal and the teachers. It's everybody in your school that's creating that climate. So I also went into another school that I'd never been in, and it was a high poverty school, and I was working for, I believe I was working for Appalachian when I did this visit. And I stood there 15 minutes before anyone would speak to me. Now, there was a clerical person at the desk, and I finally walked over and got in front of her, and finally she spoke to me, and I told her what I needed and what teacher I needed to see, and she tried to get them to answer the phone. Well, they didn't answer the phone, but there was a little student, just cute as a button. And she said, and she heard me say who I needed to see. She said, oh, I know where she is. She said, I'm going that way. If you'll just let her follow me, I'll take her to the teacher. And sure enough, she took me directly to the teacher. I knocked on the door, and she said, oh, she's right over there. And she was. Now, that student knew more about what was going on in that school than the people working there. So, that sends a message too. So you have to look at a lot of little things.
So, Dr. Todd, what you're saying makes total sense. And I guess my question is, and again, I'm South Carolina, so I'm pulling from some of those advanced ed surveys, and I've got 3 of them, but they don't ask, the questions are not set up. Like I know the North Carolina Teacher Working Conditions Survey, y'all got some bam up questions. Our question, like I've literally got like 5 questions that deal with the facilities, or like I don't have questions that are geared to a lot of what you're talking about. So can I just take the questions I do have and kind of input?
You're going to have to.
My own opinion? Like, I mean, not worded that way, but you know what I'm saying? Like, okay.
You're going to have to. And then when you create your actual, where you're going to give it another survey, you can use, borrow from the state of North Carolina. Use those questions. It'll give you the information you need. So
is it okay? Like when I create the survey, the second survey, is it okay to add in, because I know Dr. Lamb said take the direct questions from the survey and stick them in again. And like you were saying, Dr. Tillman, you kind of sometimes get different results, but is it okay to add extra stuff in the second survey?
I think it is. And I would say too, remember that you are doing qualitative in 2. I would say you could slip a little qualitative in 1 and say, as an observer, having been taught and having taught in the school however many years, qualify yourself as a legitimate observer, and you can insert qualitative information. And I don't think that would be disruptive, would it, Dr. Todd?
I don't think so either. And I think you have to take what you've got.
Yes.
Make it work for the best that you can make it work.
And the qualitative observer is quite, ethnography is quite acceptable. So I wouldn't have a problem with that at all.
Okay, any other question? All right, I realize from reading your discussion boards that many of you don't have a really good handle on how money comes to your school. Now, if you are a private school, then what I'm going to say doesn't really fit, but because private school comes from, often it's tuition, it's from grants, it's from, sources. If it's run by a church, the church supports it. So, that's where the money comes from for private schools. And a lot of times it is the tuition. Now, most public schools, and you've got a narrative, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but most public schools get federal, state, and local money. There are grants that's part of the federal money a lot of times. There's also grants that's part of the state money. Now, what comes to the actual school may only be some state money and maybe a little bit of local money, because a lot of times what will happen is your central office doesn't get a tremendous amount of money, especially if you're in a rural system. And when you're in a large system, there's never enough, regardless of whether you're in a high income area or whether you're in a low income area. So a lot of times the bulk of the money that comes from the federal government and the state will be kept at the central office. Often you will not know how much is coming to your school for your teachers because it's by position in North Carolina. In North Carolina, you are allotted teacher positions based on the number of children in your school. And then the guidelines about how many children are in a classroom, that also helps you figure out what grade levels you need. So a lot of the money for the teaching positions will only be allotment numbers. There'll be a certain number of positions. And your school will, the central office will give you a certain number of positions, and then you determine what those positions are going to be. Most of the time, the school administration includes the school administration, the principal and assistant principal. It usually comes in a block. And then your central office looks at that to see how many people they can get with the money that comes to them. Now, usually the principal is a little bit they're pulled out first, and a certain one is there's a principal allotted to every school most of the time. But then the assistant principal, sometimes that is a very small amount of money, and a lot of schools may not qualify for an assistant principal. And if they have one, then that money may have to come from some extra local funds if the local will allow that to happen. Now, one of the things that when the laws were set up, the state's job was to provide education, public education for children. So the federal government did not see that as their job. And so if you actually look at your school system money, most of it is going to come from the state. A small portion, and even though it is a small portion of what comes to your county, you can't afford to do without it. And the reason you can't is so many of that is designated for certain things. Like the EC money comes from the federal government primarily. Career and technical education comes from the federal government. So the subsidies for school food service so that you can have free and reduced lunch as reasonable as it is, that comes from the federal government. So there's certain things that allotments come to the state. You have to fill out a plan, send it to the state, and then the state sends you that federal money for your system. In many of the situations, you have to write a plan, just like you would a grant, and tell how you're going to use that money. And you doggone better use it the way you say you're going to use it, because that's one of the quickest ways that people can get fired, is when they don't use money the way it's supposed to be used or the way you said you were going to use it. Now, if something comes up and you can't use it for what you planned, there's a way to write and get approval from whoever the person is over the grants at the state level. And most of the time you don't have any contact with the federal person because the state person talks with them. But you know, that's the way that money comes to you. So almost all of you are going to have some federal money come into your system. It may be in the fact that someone appears on your doorstep to do special ed, or someone appears on your doorstep to do career and technical education, or you have a school food service program. So that's where your federal money is coming to you. And there's some other, Title I money is a big piece for especially the younger children and the younger schools. So, go ahead.
Migrant workers too sometimes.
Migrant workers, and there's getting to be, I know that's getting smaller and smaller in a lot of places because the people are not being migratory, they're staying. So, you know, that's where the federal money comes in. The state money is where the bulk of the things comes. Sometimes there will be money sent to your school for instructional materials and supplies. And there may be some for technology. There may be some for textbooks and media center books and various things like that. There's then the local money that comes to your school. The county commissioners have said for years and years and years that their job is to provide the facilities. And if you're in a rural, low-income area, they really don't want to give you a whole lot of money for any kind of supplement. They don't see that as their job, but they have come around because of the fact that the city systems that are located close to these rural areas are doing those supplements so that they can get more people. So they have started doing some supplements, but they will usually say, I don't want it to ever go above 5%. If it goes above for 5%, we're not going to support it. You know, it varies with the group of people. And some people just, you know, say that is not our job. Our job is to provide the facilities. But even with the facilities, most of the time, the money has to come through the county commissioners. So in North Carolina, the school boards do not have the ability to render a tax to come up with what they need for facilities. That has to come from the county commissioners. Now, in some areas, the school boards have that opportunity, but not in North Carolina. So just make sure that you understand that money does come to your school if you're a public school, from federal, state, and local. Each has a different opinion about what the money's to be used for, and you put it together and make your school system work. So does that help a little bit in your understanding of where the money comes to run a public school? Now, there's also grants that play a part in that too. For instance, when the early colleges started, there was money that came to the states, that the states applied for the money from the Bill Gates Foundation. And then they funded the grant, and then the local schools had to fill out. And when they were ready to start an early college, then they had to fill that out, and the approval went through the state. And to start with, it was very closely controlled, even as to who was allowed to go to those schools. The interesting thing about the money from the Bill Gates Foundation, a lot of that was used to help set them up, but mainly to make sure that teachers were taught how to do project-based learning, because they had felt like that was one of the key pieces to help children learn the most. So, and my guess is if you will visit early colleges, you will find that they do better on the end of course tests than your regular high schools do, for the most part. And it's because they keep them in a small number most of the time, but it's also because of that project-based learning. So, you know, you have to look at all of those pieces. And so there are times that grants play a big part in getting things started the right way. So I just wanted to make sure, because from your answers, I could tell that we had a lot of people really confused about how money got to their school. So I wanted to clear that up. Does that help? Okay. All right, we're going to go straight into the case study presentations. And so I want to do the Leandro case. I want us to talk about that first. We're going to start with section C4, group 3. And if you will share your screen and the PowerPoint, whoever's going to lead that one.
Dr. Todd, if you give me 1 second.
Okay.
I was doing something for my children. I'm walking back to my car to log in. So if you let the next group go, we'll be ready next.
Okay. All right. So we'll go. It is section C2, group 2 ready.
Yep.
Okay. Let's go ahead.
Let me see how to share my screen. There we go. Can you guys see the screen?
Yes, looks good.
All right. So the Leandro case, it's a 1994 lawsuit against North Carolina schools, or the state of North Carolina, by parents in 5 low-wealth rural counties. The plaintiffs argued that schools in these counties ended up with lower than average tax revenues. So school districts did not have enough money to provide an equal education for their children. They could not compete with wealthier school districts in terms of teacher pay and educational materials, which makes sense. The plaintiffs argued that the quality of the child's education ought not be dependent upon the wealth of the family and the community which that child was born. I know that we have a lot of people in different rural areas in class now, and they probably feel that same way. The plaintiffs argued that the state constitution requires North Carolina to provide schools anywhere in the state with adequate resources to fully educate disadvantaged poor, special education, and limited English proficient students. Once again, that's to educate disadvantaged, special education, and limited English proficient students. The courts held that the North Carolina Supreme Court stated that school districts and counties don't have any constitutional right to equal funding. However, they did state that all children residing in North Carolina have a fundamental state constitutional right to the opportunity to receive a sound basic education. The court defined a sound basic education as that which provides children and youth with all the opportunities to sufficiently reach the sufficient ability to read, write, and speak the English language, and a sufficient knowledge of fundamental mathematics and physical science, among other subjects. And that's my slide. Hopefully I read it slow enough for everyone to understand.
Okay, I'll go ahead and continue, Matt.
Okay.
We saw the connection between case study 2 and the Leandro case because we felt like it set the precedence for equitable funding for a sound education. And we saw that this issue came up again in case study 2. And some of the bullets that we pointed out was one principal was able to get adequate funding from the PTA to fund the technology program, while the other 2 principals were not able to receive funding because they were in an impoverished area. So we see this still being an issue, even though that case set the precedence for it is still an issue.
The last bullet that we have here where it says this puts students at an unfair advantage. Students should not be punished because of the area they live in. We talked about this, and of course, children are not asked to be born into a certain family, an impoverished family, or, you know, low income family. So we just felt like it's not, the children should not be punished for the family and the community that they were born into.
All right, anybody else?
Yes, and just to wrap it up, when our group was discussing this, one of the things that came up, and it was, I guess, a statement, and then I would love for you, Dr. Todd, Dr. Tillman, to share your insight on this. We talked about the violations that the lower court found in 2002. Now, I know that a lot of schools are transforming and to restart schools. And my discussion on last night was that seems to me to be a direct violation of the case, because it says that there should be competent teachers, well-trained teachers who are teaching the standard course of study, well-trained, competent principals, and, you know, other administrators should be certified as well, and then having the necessary resources. My concern was with restart schools, there's only a percentage of teachers that have to have that certification. And even some of the administrators are not certified. I know they have a certain time to get that certification, but I think it's kind of really relaxed. I work in a restart school, so I really believe it's relaxed. It's not a real push on go get your certification. They're maintaining their positions. And what I'm looking at when I read the Leandro background, Leandro versus the state, it is a direct violation to me. So if you could comment or share some insight on that and help me understand why we're not in violation as restart schools.
All right, let's go ahead and get the other presentations on the Leandro case, and then we'll go back and make sure that Dr. Tillman and I address that. But let's get all of them about the Leandro case. Does that work?
Yeah. My group, I've got to head out, so I hope you don't need me for anything else.
All right, Matt. Great seeing you.
Thanks, Matt.
All right.
All right, which group? Let's see. Reginald, are you ready?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, we'll go back. We'll go with your group. You were section C4, group 3. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Okay. My screen is shared. Everybody see it? Okay. So Clarence, Pauline, and myself, we discussed the Leandro case. So what we got from it was that it did start in 1994. It was again filed against the state of North Carolina by parents, children, and school districts of 5 low-wealth rural counties. And despite high tax rates, equal education was not provided to their children. They argued that the family and the community should not determine the quality of a child's education, and a higher level of stable funding should be proposed for all students. And Clarence is going to take screen 3.
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, you're good.
All right. Mostly with the Leandro, North Carolina case, which is fortunate, like equality was a very key issue. Schools claimed that they were burdened with disadvantage and more cost to educate students, which that way in a nutshell, because they wanted like the same funding for not only just for disadvantaged kids, but also for the advantaged kids as well. They also argued with the state constitution that requires North Carolina to provide schools with adequate sources to fully educate the disadvantaged. And also this includes poor special education and limited proficient students. This pretty much goes all the way back to the IDEA Act, where everyone is required to have like a free and appropriate education, regardless of what the funding is. But it's like as long as everything is equal funding, as long as they not affecting their ability to have free education, that's what they're fighting for equality.
Okay.
Pauline is going to take the next slide. Okay, well, until she chimes in, I'll just kind of go. All children in North Carolina, as established, have the right to the opportunity to receive a sound basic education. And this.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. My phone, everything's so messed up here. The state of North Carolina has the ultimate constitutional obligation to deliver every child's being on the right. No expectation, no excuses. Sound basic education defined by the 4 standards. Basically, just to kind of piggyback off of what case 1, the plaintiff's case was a violation of the 14th Amendment and the student due process. That has occurred. The quality of a child's education should not depend on the wealth of the family or the community the child has been born into. The plaintiff's purpose was a higher level of stable funding for low wealth counties.
Okay, and one thing we wanted to make sure that I thought was interesting was that it set the precedent for future ruling. And in 2010, it made sure that North Carolina students that were suspended had the right to alternative education unless the district could articulate a substantial reason of why they could not provide alternative education. And we thought that also added to the sound basic education, that just because they were suspended did not mean you didn't have the right to educate them, or that child wouldn't be so far behind when they came back from suspension. And so I thought that was very important to make sure we included. And to wrap it up, we did put our source on there, which was the Duke University Law School. And that is kind of what we took from it. Anybody else got anything before we close out? Okay.
All right. By the way, both groups have done a good job. All right. The next group is section C2, group 1.
I believe that's us, and I'll be sharing my screen.
Okay.
All right, so I'll be speaking first for the first 2 slides. Honestly, my first 2 is just giving the background information. So what I have to say is really kind of redundant because the first 2 teams have really pretty much explained the background already. Again, just, you know, the 5 rural schools that are in the low wealth counties, the issue of them being provided with a sound education, but not being provided with a sound education due to the fact of their low income status. Again, the details of the Leandro case, as a previous classmate said, they argued that they couldn't raise enough money through taxes and therefore they didn't provide quality education like the wealthier neighbors. At the heart of the claim, education should not depend on parent income or location of birth, and it costs more to educate disadvantaged children. The state is not doing enough to equalize funding for all children. I honestly feel that in some areas that's still an issue. I feel like it has not really been completely resolved, but hopefully, you know, but we are making ways, and the laws are moving in the right direction, because again, I feel like in my area, we're still seeing some of that stuff going on. That's all I got.
I am taking slide 4, and just to review the timeline, it looks like there's quite a bit of things happened between 1997 and 2019. The interesting fact is that this is a 20-year plus process. In 1997, the favorable ruling was that the state was not providing sound basic instruction to students, which is what we talked about. And basically between 2004, sorry, feedback. Can you guys hear me? Okay, maybe. So I'm on 2 devices. Basically between 2002 and 2017, they were deliberating. And in 2000, what I found most interesting was in 2019, the most recent meeting minutes showed that there was no conclusion. They set up a, what is it called? The Commission on Access for Sound Basic Education. In 2000, I think 16 or 17 members were added, and then 19 members total, which means that these people are getting paid to develop strategies for the Leandro requirements of 2002. So from 2002 to 2017, you have 15 years. Is that 15, right? 15 years of deliberation, and then only to come to a conclusion that we will deliberate more for longer, and we will pay people to deliberate. And then in 2019, we are still deliberating. So I find that particularly fascinating. And then in slide 5, in 2002, the lower court ruled, and this goes back, like I said, 15 years from 2017 when the commission was created. Every classroom must have a well-trained certified teacher. And these are the 3 points that everything else hinges on. Every school must have a competent principal with leadership skills and the ability to recognize and hire well-trained certified staff. And schools must have the resources necessary to support an effective instructional program, which means that these 3 things are not happening in classrooms right now in places that are not properly resourced, which means that there are not well-trained certified teachers, they are incompetent principals, and they do not have the resources necessary to support instruction. Next.
Then we just pulled out that the State Board of Education argued that the North Carolina landscape had changed, and so they wanted new policies and programs, which of course is where a lot of this case stemmed from and why I think it's been over this 25-year process. And as Joy pointed out, the judge did not like what the Board of Education was working on, and so he brought in this other party, the West Ed, to conduct the study and to kind of begin to work more with the findings and with the recommendations and what should happen, focusing on, as she said, the teachers, the principals, and the adequate resources. And so we just added in for the next 3 kind of the teachers that, of course, you need to attract and prepare your teachers. You know, your pay has to be equivalent. You need to be able to offer them professional development. You need to be able to offer them things that are going to entice them to be there and to stay, develop them, support them, and retain them. Which is the way that it ought to be. You should be attracting teachers that are worthy, and then you need to be doing what is necessary to develop them and retain them, which is a lot of what we've been looking at in class with the empowerment and all that stuff. And then the next one, focusing on the principals, of course, they need to be trained as well. A lot of people just simply move through a program, get the certification, but then there's no additional training once they actually step into that role. I mean, we can learn as much as possible in a class like this, but until you're actually in that role and are receiving some mentoring and coaching and training in that role, I think that it's not going to make you an effective leader. And so part of that is kind of determining those best practices for them, and then best practices for how to handle students living in poverty, students in different situations. You may not principal one school the same way you would principal another. And so there needs to be some of that in on-the-job training and mentoring and coaching. And then the last thing, of course, the adequate resources, looking at the finances, which was the initial push of the case, convening those focus groups to determine how best to do it. And that's where some of the school-based budgeting came in, and determining how they got money and who handled the money, and then developing the plan to make it possible.
Then I'm going to read off the last part here. Judge Lee appointed the West Ed consulting group out of California to study and come up with recommendations. So West Ed had to provide the court and the plaintiffs monthly progress reports on the study findings. They had to meet with the plaintiffs to inform them on progress being made for those 3 areas that we talked about before. And West Ed must provide opportunities for input. And at the time that we were studying this, we saw that the study had to be completed and submitted to the court by March 31st. And then, as Joy mentioned, there were some deliberations since on April 11th. One thing that we did not include in our PowerPoint is that North Carolina, one thing that they have done over this 25 years is they have implemented preschool programs for students and children living in poverty for all 4-year-olds. So that's one thing that they have complied with, but many that they haven't.
Okay. Anything else? Or we'll go to the last group, section C2, group 4.
All right, so that's myself and Melissa, and I'm going to share my screen. Maybe I can. Okay, you guys, can you see? I don't know what I'm looking at. Can you guys see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay, so I'm clicking on share. How about now?
There you go. We got it.
The technology teacher who can't figure this out. Okay, so I'll start. Alrighty. So the background is the same. Everyone has gone through that. 5 rural low wage counties in North Carolina sued the state back in '94. Those counties are listed there. They couldn't compete with more wealthier districts. They didn't generate enough tax to support the teachers or the students, and so they sued. They felt that they felt that they were overburdened
by disadvantaged students, at-risk students, because they cost more to educate. The Supreme Court of North Carolina basically ruled that every child has the right to a sound basic education, and that it is the state, not the district's responsibility to see that that happens. As the other groups have mentioned, what a sound basic education is listed here. Excuse me. One of the things that we talked about, Melissa and I, was the case study that talked about student-based budgeting and how the money would follow the students, how at risk, or not really at risk, but how students with needs would have the money follow them and that they wouldn't be left out financially, and how that's a good idea. So one of the questions was, is the superintendent's plan, a good idea? And I think having the money follow the student in this regard is a good idea. Melissa, you want to chime in? My little one's pulling me to play Baby Shark.
Was that the last slide or?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, just going back to the Leandro case is looking at the case and the fact that it still hasn't really been resolved, and that there have been things put in place, like other classmates have said with the 4K program. South Carolina has done the same thing. In certain districts, like our school district has a 4K program based on disadvantaged students. So I would, and then we tied it into the other case study because we wanted to see how that superintendent was successful with that, with the money actually being for those students and having those students more, it would follow them. So that way they have the money that they need to be successful. And I think that's where, I think that's why we had to read both of them to see how they relate to each other.
Okay. Anything else from your group?
No, ma'am.
Okay. I told you that Dr. Tillman and I would comment after the last group made their presentation. Well, I was a principal when the Leandro case first started being talked about, and then I was at the central office for several years. Judge Manning was the person who was doing a lot with making the decisions about what the state was saying they were providing, and he would look and he would go in and he would say, that's not enough. And so then I saw where it was handed off to Judge Lee. But you're right, this is a 25-year-old case. I mean, 25 years that the state's been dealing with this. I think that you can see from some of the things that's been done along the way that they've been trying to do some things. They've been trying to make sure that they have a curriculum that addresses everybody learning to read and to write and to do math. And then they've added the pre-K programs. It is a much more complicated thing than most people realize. And the real truth of the matter is, when you have the legislature providing the money, they're not going to be wanting a judge to tell them what they have to do. And so you have that additional complication there. And I suspect that's had a lot to do with the 25 years that it's continuing on. I think it will be interesting to see what is finally decided. And I look forward to hearing that if and when they finally make a final judgment on it. But the state has been working for the last 25 years to improve education for all. Now, in the last few years, they've not been providing as much money as they should to meet the basic needs for any school. They have been cut. Teachers have been cut. It is to the point that in North Carolina, it's going to be a teacher shortage because in the university system, there are very few people going into education. Now, the people like you all are getting additional degrees but there needs to be people to replace you when you decide to retire. And it is not being encouraged by the way that their teachers are being treated at this particular point in time. And so it is to the point that there's going to be a shortage, and there already is in several of the school systems, and some of you are talking about that. Now, the Restart schools, I suspect, has something to do with the No Child Left Behind, which is a federal law more so than a state law. I'm not that familiar with Restart, but when you go back and look at the No Child Left Behind, after so many years, you either had to fire the principal and fire the teachers, reorganize the school, and in many cases it was you did one and then you did the other, and if you still didn't see improvement, then that's where I suspect the Restart schools are coming from. But I'm not 100% sure about that. Dr. Tillman, am I on the right track?
Well, I think there were 4 or 5 different models that when Obama said, wasn't he the guy that said race to the top?
That was during his time, yes.
Okay, and so there were like 4 or 5 models, and the Restart was one of those. And it was basically flexibility in hiring and funding and making sure you still had to provide transportation, which a charter school, you don't have to do that actually to a charter school. But there was a lot of flexibility, and a lot of people don't like that. But one of the schools, and I don't remember the name of the school, I mean, this is sort of off the top, down at close to one of the military bases. They couldn't find math and science teachers and foreign language teachers, and so they got a waiver through this model to hire people on the military base. So they had, chemists teaching chemistry and rocket scientists teaching, some of their science classes and their math classes. So even though they weren't certified teachers, they were really good. Another example of that is the School of Science and Math. If you have, I have a son that went there, and his professors, it's a public school. It's funded under under Chapel Hill, under the university system, but it is a public residential high school, and the teachers there do not have to have a teaching license. They just have to be recognized as an expert in their field. So, it's not all bad that you have unlicensed teachers. But the flexibility to hire is one of the big things for a Restart school. And I think there are some bad things about it, because Leandro, if you think about it, if you're saying you have these standards and people say, well, we can't meet those standards. So, okay, well, let's do Restart over here. We don't have to do all this stuff. So I can see it can be a good thing. It can be a bad thing. But I would say maybe, I think there's a couple of you that have Restart schools. And so if you do, you know something about it, and you can read about it. I'm sure Mr. Google will tell you something about it. But anyway, that's all I know about it, Dr. Todd. And that may not be right, but I think it is pretty much.
Well, and I think, I really think that goes back to the federal legislation is not really tied to the state court ruling. One of the things that happens whenever you get in a school system that there is some kind of federal lawsuit brought against your school system,
yeah.
It takes years. And usually the child that the parents brought the lawsuit against the system for, they're graduated and educated and through college before the system is released. So, you saw an example of 25 years this has been going on. And the ones of you that are relatively young and been in the school system recently, I'm surprised you haven't heard of it, but my guess is it was in the news all the time when Judge Manning was dealing with it. He would go through things, and then he would bring out a part of a ruling, and then he would go through more, and then, you know, so we were constantly getting things, or he was asking for more information. So there, from 94 to 2008, we were very aware of what was going on. Well, I suspect when they changed judges, and then when they started this study and they hired this group, that they're just waiting for the information. And I suspect that it'll come back in focus here in the near future. But the other thing that has occurred that has probably caused an issue is that you've had a total change in state board superintendent. A lot of the state board members have changed. You've had a total focus in the state legislature that has changed. And so, you know, a lot of them may not even be aware of all of the things that we were dealing with for years. But I think therefore, a long time, we were trying to address whatever Judge Manning brought out, and we were trying to come up with ways to do that. And, you know, the charter schools, they have always been given the flexibility in hiring whoever they chose to hire. They didn't have to be certified teachers. They didn't have to have principals who were certified administrators. And I suspect the restart is allowing that flexibility that occurs with the charter school to happen with some of the schools that may have had a lot of issues prior to going through the restart, or they're in an area that's high poverty and they cannot find teachers and people don't want to move there. And, you know, they've got to have somebody in those classrooms. And so sometimes that's what you wind up doing is you wind up trying something and hoping that it will work. And a lot of times, and this is one thing to pay attention to, a lot of times if people buy into it, they make it work. And they make the progress that's needed because they believe in what they're doing, even if they're not all certified the way that they need to be certified. They can make it work. And for years, I have said it's the relationship between the teacher and the student that determines whether learning is going to occur more so than anything else. If the student likes the teacher, the student is going to do whatever they can to make the teacher happy and to make this teacher look good. If they don't give a flip. And so it is really, you know, a lot of it is that interaction between the teacher and the student. If they know that you care about them, I'm not talking about touchy-feely kind of stuff, but the strictest teacher can show that they care about somebody and the student's going to know it. So, you know, all of those things, that's where the environment and the climate of the school plays such a big part in what happens. All right, now I'm going to ask you a question. It's your decision. We have 3 groups to present on the case study. Do you want to just go longer tonight, or do you want to stop for tonight and then pick that up next week? Give me an idea what you want to do.
If we finish tonight, are we meeting next week?
Not unless you all have things you want me to go over with you.
I'd say keep going.
Okay.
It's up to the group.
All right. Is that okay with everybody?
Yeah.
All right. Section C2, Group 3, you have the superintendent's plan and for case study 2 to talk about.
I believe that's our group. Angela, are you still on with us?
I am. Do you want to share the screen or do you need me to, Sabrina?
Sure, I'll go ahead and share it now.
Okay.
Let's see. I think I have it. There we go.
Okay. And can everybody hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. In our case study, a superintendent sent a letter to the family and community members about piloting the student-based budgeting system at 4 schools. And that system gives money directly to schools based on the number of students enrolled and the needs of the students. So we had to determine whether the superintendent's plan was appropriate. And after we had our Zoom session, we said that there were some strengths for the student-based budgeting plan. It gives administrators power to make decisions for the positions that they need. They can spend the money the way that they see fit. It follows the district and school goals for involvement and achievement, improvement and achievement. It's not just based on enrollment, but it's based on student needs as well. And an example that we listed was Title I schools get more funds, and sometimes other schools who are not Title I schools don't get as much funding. And this kind of creates some differences and resources between schools. Also, the student-based budgeting system is transparent because the formula is followed each time, so administrators know exactly how much money they're going to receive, and it's just a transparent system. And we also said that equity is not the same as equal. There were some concerns about the superintendent's plan. It can be time consuming for school officials and staff. Leaders must know how to budget money, and they must know what to do with the money in order to meet all their needs. Some schools with larger enrollments end up with fewer resources and even sometimes larger class sizes. There may be restructuring of some central office positions, which I thought was interesting. There may not be a need for a chief financial officer at the district office level because administrators are in charge of the funds for the school. And determining the formulas for how much money you receive can be a complicated process. Also, there's an accountability issue. Who will make sure that the funds are being used appropriately? Who will make sure that the Title I funds or whatever funds are received are following the federal guidelines? We said that it was important with that process to have a team of leaders and a treasurer to kind of have a system of checks and balances. There will be greater demands placed on the principals because the principals will function as chief financial officers, which can be a problem. And, you know, if a principal can handle that much autonomy, that's great, but it does give the principal a lot of autonomy. Mm-hmm. Our group had trouble deciding if this plan was appropriate. We had some mixed emotions. It could be wise since the funding follows the needs of the students, but we thought we would need more information about the team of individuals making the decisions, their qualifications. We need more information about the school, the community, the demographics, the socioeconomic status, achievement. And we also said that principals even voiced their concerns during the piloting of this program. So we were not able to determine a decision. We thought there were pros and cons, but we would need some more information before we made a decision. Does anybody else have anything to add from my group?
No, thank you, Angela. That was great.
Okay. The next group is section C4, group 2.
That would be us. I'm going to share my screen.
Okay.
Oops. Can everyone see that?
Not yet.
Okay, I thought I hit it. Oh gosh. How about that?
Yep. Yes. Yes.
All right, here we go. Okay. Prior to last night, our group had already met one day last week. And so we actually did the entire case study as it was presented with the first part with the case from North Carolina, as well as the questions pertaining to the superintendent. And Latia, you want to take it from there?
Okay. Okay, so wait a minute. Go to slide 4, Andrew.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so pertaining to the superintendent's plan, whether or not it was appropriate, present both sides of the issue. It said we did two sides. So side one, although the student-based budgeting is a great idea, the predetermined formula is not very transparent if the formula and things like EVOS is not shared with all stakeholders. Finally, how will schools be held accountable for proper allocations of these funds? We compared it to the EVOS system and how we didn't, we talked about how we didn't understand how the formula worked with EVOS, and so that's where we brought the EVOS into it, because of the fact that I guess you could say related it to our lives right now. So that's where that came from.
And although the formula, they weren't very transparent about what they did, how they did, and how things were going to be handled.
Excuse me.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide. And this is side 2 of whether or not the superintendent's plan is appropriate.
This slide just talked about what will happen with the schools whose student population will not benefit from more funding. Where would these funds come from? What data will be used to allocate such funding? And so we were talking about for that, like, how do we know it still would be equitable funding? Like, and what about kids when they go to high school? Do the funding follow them to high school? Or coming from elementary school, does their funding follow them from elementary school? So how will we know for sure, especially if we don't know a formula, how do we know for sure that we're getting the right funding for these kids?
Okay, anything else from your group?
We just, like, we more or less, I mean, we discussed it. Well, we have just a lot of questions about it. Like they were all saying, and I wrote this in my reflection, how do they choose those kids? And even, not even just going from middle school or high school, but if they transfer from school to school, do those funds follow them? Or say they qualify for the funds based on the data, but then they start showing improvement, then do they lose those funds? Or, yeah, I just had a lot of questions about it.
Well, and I think that is one thing that you can have a lot of questions about. Because I think it's something that we don't really understand and is so foreign from what we're doing in most states that I think it's going to raise a lot of questions.
Okay.
All right. Anything else from your group? Did you have any points that you wanted to bring out about Leandro that the other groups did not?
I think they kind of summed it up.
Okay.
Yeah,
they did good.
Okay. We said all of the same things that everyone else had said. Pretty much all of the case study deals with equality.
Okay. All right. And then that brings us to section C4, group 1.
That would be our group. All right, so let's see if you see this.
We can see it.
Okay, great. We also went through the Leandro case and looked at it and said much of the same that everyone else has said. And then we focused on what the superintendent sent to the parents. And some of the pros that we noted were that it is very consistent with the Leandro case because children should have access to resources, and they noted that all schools are not the same, and this plan certainly notes that all schools are not the same. We noted that the superintendent was contacting the parents to inform them of the process. In our group, we talked about that a little bit. There was nothing on the part of the parents, so then nothing you could do if you disagreed with that. It didn't seem that it was just, this is what's getting ready to take place. With respect to the student budgeting, providing those additional resources, we felt like that was a good way to look at how you would allocate resources appropriately for students based on the Leandro ruling. And then we also noted that the pilot program would give you data to support decisions that would be made in the process. Anyone else from my group want to chime in?
Go ahead, you're doing a great job.
That's moral support, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so for cons, one of the things that we talked about was we felt like that how would schools, and I think the last group talked about this, how would the group, the funding go from year to year, and the funding, it says that it followed the student, but you know, if a student is moving from one school to the next, then how is that affecting the schools? With principals or administrators have made decisions on teachers based on that funding, how could that possibly change as students move around? We were talking about the predetermined weights that would be established for students. We were concerned about the bias from, you know, who's going to make those decisions as to which students are more at risk. I mean, how would that actually be determined? It mentioned a predetermined weight, but we would like to know some more information about that. We also talked about the sample size. It mentions that 4 pilot schools were chosen, but out of how many schools in the entire district? Because, you know, were those schools true samples for what their district looks like? We also mentioned that in some ways this was similar to the flat grant funding that was in Chapter 2. And that was really ruled as being inherently unfair. So we saw some similarities with that. It does mention that what makes that unfair is the account for regional cost differences. And so when you think about areas in North Carolina, for example, there are higher costs for living in an area. So, you know, a teacher that's living in a Raleigh area making the same amount of income as a teacher that's living in a more rural area where maybe the cost is not as much. So and even materials and supplies. We talked about, would there be some sort of baseline that would be for all students? They're mentioning at-risk students, but what about a baseline for all? And then we also mentioned that would the district strategically place a percentage of children that were at risk in the school throughout the district, because we were concerned that if you had a school that was full of a lot of students that were at risk, you would have a lot more money and dollars funneled into it, and you would have possibly a school that maybe there was a disadvantage to a nearby school that didn't have those funds available. So we wondered if there would be any type of strategic way to place or cluster those students in those schools. So anyone from my group want to add anything? Okay, so I'll stop there.
Okay, I think we've had every group do their presentation and we've talked about that. I'd like to just make a few comments and encourage Dr. Tillman to do the same thing. You brought up some really good points when you said, are those the number of schools, is that representative of the district? And that's something you would have to know. There's a lot of things you don't know in this situation. There's also a lot of responsibility that's going to fall on this principal. And how many of you at this point in your career, if you went into school as a brand new principal, would want that responsibility and not have the backup from the central office going through all those numbers and making sure that they, you know, one of the sad parts about budgeting is often the state, I have been a superintendent when the state didn't pass their budget till October. They would give you the number of teaching positions in the time for your school to start, but they did not give you your budget until October. And so you were operating with basically nothing except what you had from the county and what little federal money came, and then the teaching positions until they passed the budget. So, you know, that would put, if the money is not coming in, that really puts you in a really difficult position. So I think a lot has to do with what's the qualifications of that principal and how many principals are strong in budgeting. You know, that's why they have a chief financial officer, because that's their strength. They know the law that relates to budgeting, and they know the law that's related to funding and making sure everything is used in the right way. So I have a lot of misgivings about this particular way of doing things. I think it's better to have a combination. I think that there should be some things that are done at the central office level to keep that protective layer off of your shoulders. But then I think the materials and supplies and the resources that you purchase for your school, I think that should be your decision within limits. And the reason I say that is one of the things we ran into when I was a principal is almost all of our schools were using different reading programs in K-5. Well, that was not a smart move, because we had kids who would start at my school and then they'd go down the hill, and from that school they'd go to the next school, and a lot of that had to do with when the parents could not pay their rent money and they were evicted. And so they went from one to the next to the next to the next. So then you were constantly putting children in different reading groups and in different reading books. And so we decided that we had to come together on that. And so sometimes there are good reasons for having district decisions, and you can't do everything at your school. Like I've told you all along, you are one part of a system unless you are a school by yourself. And if you're a school by yourself, you can pretty much do anything you want to with whatever money comes to you. But not many of you are going to have those jobs. So, you know, there's a lot of advantage to having district things. But then when it comes to making sure your teachers have what they need and the resources that they need to do the best job with your children, that's where your school improvement team is really important. And that's where that school improvement team should be meeting with all the teachers and finding out what they need, letting the principal know, and then what money the principal has control over. That's what they should be purchasing things for. Dr. Tillman, do you want to add anything?
That sounds really good. The only thing I wanted, I had a while ago, I was thinking of anything we needed to say, and I just want to make sure everyone has registered for completion, because I think there's a fee, additional fee, if you don't register soon. So if you haven't registered to finish in August, make sure that you get it done right away. And,
thank you. That's really important. And also, some of you have wondered why I have done something different with the skip than what I did with the OMA. It was the OMA, I gave you points when you got a proficient score or not. The skip, I decided with that it's sort of like the EOGs, the EOCs. You're supposed to count it some in the grade that you give the children in North Carolina. Well, I decided that if you have a proficient score, I'd give you 90 points. If you have an excellent score of 4, I'd give you 100. The whole thing is you're still going to get your A. It's not going to affect your A as long as you've done all your other work. Because I allowed 200 points between an A and A minus. So, and I don't hardly ever take off over 5 points unless you just haven't done something, or 10 points at the max. So it was not meant to catch you, but it was just to remind you that those evaluators have a purpose. And so I just felt like I should at least consider part of what they're saying in the points that I give. So I just want you to understand where my thinking is coming from. If you don't have, and I think I did send out an email to give you the number of points that you had possible, and then the number of points. And there's a little bit of a difference between the two sections. One section, it is 5,000 points, and the other section is 4,800 points. And the difference is one section, when Dr. Lamb loaded it, he left in there he left in there for you to submit for twice. In one section he didn't, in one section he did. So I didn't catch it until everybody had already done that. So that's the reason one section has that. As far as getting the points back, you don't need them because, you know, I'm giving you 200 points. 200 points. So unless you just don't turn in your assignments, you're going to get your A. So I would not worry about trying to get the points back. Just get the work done. Since we have gone over, I will not have a session next week unless somebody sends me something and says, we really don't understand this and we want to know more about it. So unless I get something like that, and if I can, I will address it. If you have those questions, send them to me and I will address it in the focus that I will do at the beginning of next week. Some of you are just about finished. Some of you are very close, and some of you have a lot of work to get done in a very short period of time. So please don't put it off until after or 2 days before the grades are due, because if you turn in 45 things that I've got to grade, I've got to read them, and I've got to have time to do that. So please, please get your work in. All right, any other questions before I end this meeting? Thank you for attending. Yes, Kelly.
And I do have a question real quick. I asked Dr. Tillman this Wednesday, but I just wanted to confirm, for our next semester, will we have where it's like the end of the school year and things like that, will we have as many like case studies and discussion boards and things like that, or?
I have taught 5 that course before, but I honestly do not remember.
Okay.
Because I've been so busy.
Dr. Lamb said that they had already revamped 5. There was some concern about whether it was going to be ready, but I think it's been revamped, and the case studies are there according to what he said, because they've been running them. And didn't he say that in the last faculty meeting?
He did say that, but he also, I just got access to the course that I'm teaching this summer this week, so I don't know whether all of the information is loaded or not, or whether it's just, you know, it may have been they loaded all of 605 first. So okay. I would go in and make sure you are registered first of all, and then secondly, make sure that you are registered to complete this summer. And those of you who are behind, start getting that work turned in. Please, please do that. Yeah. One of the questions was the final date to have work turned in. I am thinking it is around the middle of that first week in May. I will have to look it up and get back to you. They will cut the number of discussion boards down because what they've always done is they took out and just made the summer session, which is 10 weeks, the bare bones. But there will be case studies, and they have revamped it. So they really try to make sure that it is doable. So my guess is it will focus on the first few weeks. We'll focus on getting the CAP finished and the PSYOP, and this last one you've already done everything. You just have to pull bits and pieces.
Could I interject something there? I just love what you just said. I just love it. And all along I've been saying, make sure you use a format that looks like, you know, from each evidence to the next. Think about the organization, use the same format. Well, if you did, praise be, because when you get there, the format's going to be already set, and you're just going to be able to pull it all together, and you're going to say, oh, that's why they wanted me to do that. So...
And my guess is that, you see, this will have to be turned in by about the end of June in order to have everything finished. That's the reason they want us to, or encourage you to go ahead and get ahead and work on the CAP. And then that probably during the month of July, you'll focus on some of those case studies, those other things. So that's what usually happens when they do that.
And finishing your competency folio. It can't be carried over next semester because it's got to be turned in.
That last semester, you've got to get your total internship hours. You've got to get your competency folio and competency analysis.
Yes, and the final the dispositions.
School of Ed dispositions. So there's a lot of little things that last summer.
Yes.
All right, do you all have anything else? First of all, let me say thank you so much. I know tonight's been long, but we will not meet next week. And I have enjoyed working with you, and I hope you will have a wonderful summer and a wonderful ending class. So have a great rest of the week.
And I will be meeting with people tomorrow. I'll be sending you a link. If I don't have anybody after 20 minutes, I'll close down, and I'm not having office hours on Sunday. But if you want to meet, I'll be glad to Zoom. I'll be glad to talk. But I only had 1 or 2 people last time for class, and I had no one for office hours. So
can we submit our internship log already?
Pardon me?
Can we submit our internship log already?
Well, I guess you can, but you're not finished with your internship, so I would advise that you...
I mean the 80 hours for the semester.
Well, if 80 hours is all you're interested in, that's fine. Go ahead and submit. If it's 80 hours or more, it's up to you. I've already beaten that horse. I think it's nice for you to put in what you're doing so that you have a good record of all of your accomplishments, but it's up to you. 80 hours is what the man says, and 80 hours is all Raleigh is expecting, and why would you want to expect more than the minimum requirement, right?
Well, what is the date of what's the date of the end of this semester?
The end of this semester is, okay, next week is the end of class. So that would be May the 3rd.
Okay, so we could stop at around then, and that would be okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got until the end of next week, and you may have until about the middle of the next week to get everything turned in. But I'll have to check on that for sure. But this week and next week is the very last week, and then I think they give us a few days after that. But then we'll have, when they give me it has to be turned in by this date, then I'm going to have to do that. And if you are way behind and haven't got a bunch of the stuff in, then I need to be talking to you, and Dr. Lamb needs to work out something for you.
Right. Yeah, I was just talking about the internship log. So if we go through May 3rd, that should be good.
May 3rd would be great. Yes.
Okay.
So just think about the fact that the internship log is the last thing on the competency folios. So when you make your last pass through the competency folio, put it in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Y'all have a great rest of the week. And again, I've enjoyed working with you, and I wish you well.
See you
Goodbye.
tomorrow.